Hi everybody and welcome to this webinar for training providers and employer providers on what's involved in an assurance review or audit and how you can be prepared. My name's Nick Duff from the Service Engagement team within the Apprenticeship Service and I'll be hosting today's session. Can I remind you that by registering and attending today, you've given your consent and you're agreeing that the webinar will be recorded and be uploaded onto our YouTube channel. And if you feel that you've changed your mind regarding that consent, can I ask that you please dial off? Okay, so today's session, what we're going to do is we're going to cover why we do assurance reviews and what's covered in them, and also what you need to do, and then also what the common issues and areas are that can be approved. So I'm happy to say that I don't have to do that, but it will be down to my colleagues Helen Boone and Daniel Kirkup from our provider market oversight team. And joining them to answer some questions, we've also got Mike Long, who's one of our senior account managers, and by Sharon Holmes, who's also from the provider market oversight team. So they'll be giving you today's input. So a big welcome to all of you. And just before I hand over to those guys, what I will say is that there'll be links within the presentation, especially towards the end of the presentation, of places that you can go to access information and support. So what we've done is we've put together a PDF document. You can get that from the control panel. So you should see a section that says handouts. So you can go and access that and download a copy of the links, so you don't have to scribble them down whilst they're on the screen. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so taking us through our main input today, we've got Helen Boone, and I think Daniel will be either adding bits to the session or will be answering questions in the Q&A session. So can I hand over to Helen? And Helen, over to you.
Thank you, Nick. So good afternoon, everybody. I think we need to go on to the next slide, please. Sorry, thanks. So today we're going to cover the following objectives. We really wanted to give you an understanding today as to why we carry out an audit and what our responsibilities are, as well as who we audit and when. I will also be taking you through the steps of an audit so that you can gain an understanding of what happens when you have an audit. And then finally, we will then take you through some common issues that we find at an audit of apprenticeship funding. Next slide, please. So why do we audit? So as well as needing a sector level understanding of payments made to providers, the National Audit Office need to be able to place reliance on the work that we undertake. They will review our work as part of their audit of the ESFA when they look at regularity and use of funds. The results of the random audits are used to enable the National Audit Office to make a judgment on the overall level of error within the ESFA financial statements. So the error rate is derived from the errors identified from our random sample, which is then extrapolated across the unaudited population. Next slide, please. So we are responsible for auditing all types of providers. So as you can see, there's the what we call ITPs, independent training providers, and colleges, and what we call new providers. We also do audit as well some loans only providers and special post-16 institutions. We select providers on a random basis every year, so we can look at up to circa 100 providers in any one year. This will include what we call new providers for whom we do a controls visit. These types of providers are those that are new to apprenticeship funding within the last 2 academic years, and I'll talk a little bit more about these types of audits shortly. We also audit providers who've been selected on a risk basis. This is taking into account some risk factors when we select which providers to audit. This is normally a much smaller sample than the random one. We currently do not audit universities, but there are plans for these to be included in the future. When we audit a provider, we will audit all funding streams that are on the ILR. So that could be the 16 to 19, the AEB, the apprenticeship, the loans, and learner support funds. Next slide, please. So who and when do we audit? So full assurance reviews, which is all funding streams, are undertaken on a lagged basis. But just to say here that we take account of both in-year and lagged assurance when providing our overall assurance opinion to the NEO. The definition of in-year assurance is where the assurance received is in the same assurance year to the 31st of March. So this is on a financial year, not academic year. So we don't normally start our audits until April. So this is why our assurance reviews are mainly undertaken on a lagged basis. So that lagged basis, as I say, is where the income paid and the expenditure incurred covers a different 12-month period to the assurance year. As I said earlier, in a normal year, we would endeavour to start our audit programme in April, where we concentrate initially on ITPs, and then college audits will normally start around September time with the intention to complete these before the accounts need to be finalised. Due to COVID last year and again this year, the audit programme did not commence until September. This year, though, it was mainly because we had to do some additional work on COVID recovery funding given to providers. So we undertook some additional audits, which meant we could not start the random sample until September. So these audits are currently underway and they will cover 2020-2021 funding. But this then means that a high number of our audits are undertaken after the ILR is closed. So we've still got quite a few obviously to go through, and these will be after that October deadline. So that has implications for recovery where we do find errors. So for example, the data cannot be amended through the ILR to recover the funds, so we have to instead look to offset against future payments. Controls visits are in-year, so this is where we get our in-year assurance. These do look at in-year claims as the audits are undertaken in January normally, but the objective of these is to look at providers' controls over apprenticeship funding and to ensure they understand the complex rules surrounding this funding stream. We select a sample, and for each audit we look at a small sample of learners. Providers are required to complete a controls questionnaire which we review and test against. The audit will result in a report containing findings and recommendations where we identify that provider is not conforming to the funding rules and or where there are no processes or controls to ensure funds are used as intended. Next slide, please. I just wanted to mention here about external audit requirements because this year a big change was made in the post-16 audit code of practice, which you can view on gov.uk. The financial statement auditors are now required to undertake some assurance work on funding received by a provider, and this is mainly affects colleges. This is in line with the international standards on auditing. Our funding assurance reviews performed are not designed to replicate the work of an external auditor who must form their own judgment as to the depth and breadth of work required. They are designed to provide assurance that funding paid has been used for the purposes as intended by Parliament. This has been a big change for financial statement auditors, some of whom have not had to do this kind of testing before. Next slide, please. I'm now going to go through the different steps on how we undertake an audit. So step one, like I said earlier, we will test all funding streams. So we will use the ILR to identify which ones need to be tested. We will also look at subcontracting, where a provider has subcontractors, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. For ESF, we only check that the learner was informed of ESF funding where applicable, and where applicable, there are logos on the main documents. We have a separate ESF match compliance team that undertakes fuller audits on this. Step two, so we normally give no more than 4 weeks notice of an audit. We obtain the contact details from our territorial team to contact you to book the audit and discuss the process of the audit. Often following this, we will then deal with an appropriate member of staff within the organisation, such as a member of staff responsible for MIS or compliance. We will explain that we will use the most uploaded ILR. So as I said, we use the one that's already been uploaded. We don't ask you to upload another one. Following the pandemic, we've been undertaking audits remotely, but we are now starting to undertake visits on site. Our audits will now most likely be a hybrid of the two. Obviously, we respect any providers who do not wish us to attend on site. For remote visits, evidence is scanned and sent to us, or we're often given access to electronic systems if providers have those. Obviously, if we're out on site, then we're looking at whatever you can provide to us on site. Following the agreement of the date of the start of the audit, we will issue a confirmation letter. Next slide, please. So the next step in the process is that we will process the ILR and run PDSAT reports. So PDSAT is Provider Data Self-Assessment Toolkit, and I hope you've all heard of that, because we really hope that you're all using this toolkit. It is available for everyone to use, and we always recommend that providers run PDSATs regularly to ensure that data is correct. For those who are not familiar with PDSATs, this toolkit will provide a number of reports, some of which need to be reviewed to ensure that the data is accurate. Guidance is available on gov.uk on installing and running PDSATs. We will review the reports as part of our planning process. This sometimes identifies some potential errors, and we will raise this as part of the audit. We sometimes also decide that further testing is required, and we'll select an additional sample in order to do this. I also want to just mention here, while we're talking about data correction, that providers should also check the funding rules monitoring dashboard to see whether there are any errors or anomalies being identified from your ILR. These will need to be corrected by R14, or if not, funds are clawed back. And guidance is also available on gov.uk in respect of their reports. This is a different team to us, but we think it's equally important that these are looked at. Next slide, please. Within the PDSAT toolkit, there is a sampling module to randomly select our main substantive sample. Currently, the maximum sample size per funding stream is 30 learners for a full assurance visit. So if you've got 3 funding streams, basically we'll be looking at 90 learners. And it's 10 learners for a controls visit. We normally give about 5 to 10 days notice of the learner samples. Now we always send the samples to the provider in an encrypted format, and the password is sent separately. We would expect the provider to also follow the same example in protecting the data by sending evidence, etc., to us in an encrypted format. And we offer a tool called Galaxy Key for this. So for field work, either remotely or on site, this will consist of reviewing evidence and compliance testing against the funding rules. And we will use standard working papers for this, so everyone's using the same tests as we do this. Next slide, please. So treatment of evidence. So when we're doing our testing, and when we're looking at evidence, if there is no evidence to support the claim, then we will class this as a funding error. We assess, though, any identified error to see whether it can be ring-fenced. So by ring-fencing, this is where we identify all learners with the same characteristic that needs to be checked. So for example, if you had a withdrawal date that was incorrect, that resulted in a funding error for one learner in the sample, we would then tell you that 100% check would need to be done. We would pull together a list of all withdrawals. So this is our ring fencing, and ask the provider to undertake 100% check of these to see if the error is systematic, and hence whether there are other errors within the population. This helps us to get an actual error across the population rather than an estimated error. For the provider, the 100% check can be time-consuming. We can only ask that the provider prepares themselves that they will need to find the resource to undertake this work. And obviously we won't know until we start the testing whether there will be a requirement for this. Where a 100% check has been done, we will test a small sample of that to gain assurance that the self-audit work undertaken by the provider is accurate. Where we cannot ring-fence an error, we categorise the error as random. Next slide, please. So prior year errors. So for each error identified, we assess whether it impacts on funding claimed by the provider in a prior year. So the prior year funding will relate to a specific learner. For example, where we find a learner was not eligible, then all funding for that learner is at risk, and we will recover this. This may include funding paid in previous years. This is for all errors, so even those identified by the provider as part of the 100% check, and we will separately record this funding in the report. But just to mention here, though, that we do reserve the right to review previous year's ILR if we find systematic issues or high error rates. We will look at a whole ILR in respect of the previous year. I cannot say this enough. Providers should be using PDSATs themselves to minimise the risk of errors and assure themselves on the data quality and completeness and accuracy of the ILR. This will help to prevent us having to go back and look at any prior years. Next slide, please. So during the audit, we aim to give daily feedback during the fieldwork stage. When we aim to clear issues as soon as possible, including the locating of alternative or missing evidence and resolving queries. For the interim feedback, which we normally give at the end of the fieldwork stage, this can be either face-to-face or by Teams meeting if the audit has been done remotely. And we'll go through each of the errors that we have identified with you. But this will give the provider an interim indication of the errors, but there will still be opportunities for the provider to provide further evidence and clear those funding errors. So we will set a time scale for that, for you to submit that further evidence, and then we will review that and remove the funding error if that evidence clears it. Next slide, please. So on completion of all testing, so that includes the review of any additional evidence and further testing of any of the provider's 100% work, we give final written feedback to the provider. We will arrive at up to 3 opinions on the provider's use of funds for 3 different funding streams. Well, these are funding models, probably is a more appropriate word here. So for carrying apprenticeships in AEB, which is funding model 35, apprenticeships, which is funding model 36, and 16 to 19 funding model 25, then we'll give an opinion. And each opinion is dependent upon the error rate in the respective original sample. So an error rate of less than 5% will result in an opinion of satisfactory on the use of funds, but an error rate at or above 5% will result in an opinion of unsatisfactory on the use of funds. An unsatisfactory opinion may result in an audit the following year. Next slide, please. So subcontracting. So we carry out, as it says here, we carry out a high-level review of each subcontract. We obtain the details of the provider's subcontractors from the subcontractor declaration and the ILR. But to ensure completeness, where we identify the use of a subcontractor that provider has not recorded on the declaration, for example, using PDSAPs or during the actual testing or through conversation with provider, we also test and will report that accordingly. We also check that the prime is delivering something of substance and not all deliveries undertaken by the subcontractor where this rule applies. Next slide, please. So for data amendments and recovery, the provider must correct all errors through the ILR data amendment by the next ILR monthly return. But obviously this is only where this is still possible. So if we've gone past the ILR close date, then this is not a way of recovering it. So there, in those occasions then where data amendment is not possible, we will offset against future payments. This is obviously more common at the moment as many of our audits are post ILR. Hopefully next year we'll start our audit program earlier and there'll be more back to what, correcting the errors through the ILR. Once the errors have been agreed and data amendments made where applicable, we will issue the final report. This will include all of the findings and recommendations, as well as an error summary giving details of the errors and the error rates and our opinions. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to go through the common issues. So that was all the steps of the audit, but this is now the next part where we'll talk about the common issues. And these are ones that have been found to date. So it does not include issues from 21-22 funding, as we've yet to audit that funding year. Next slide,
just
please.
Before we go on to the common findings, can I just say to people, remind everybody that if you've got questions to ask Helen and the team, then please do pop them into that question box facility. We've had some in, but I'd encourage you to take the opportunity to ask any questions whilst you've got Helen and the team on the call. So sorry for interrupting, Helen, but carry on.
No, that's fine. Thanks. Okay. So these are the common errors that we've been finding when we've been going out to audit on apprenticeships. So the first one is evidence of start of learning. So the start date is really important as when the funding starts. So it is not necessarily the enrolment date if no learning has taken place on the enrolment date. So funding errors have been occurring where there's no evidence of learning activity from a learner's start date. So you must ensure that that date is correct. Off the job, this is the one that gives us the biggest headache. As you know, off the job is a statutory requirement for an English apprenticeship. To be eligible for government funding, it must be at least 20% of the apprentice's normal working hours over the planned duration of the apprenticeship practical period must be spent on off-the-job training. Now we find this a lot at audit, that there is a lack of documentary evidence to demonstrate how off-the-job training was planned, how this could be achieved within the available time, as well as the details of activity that comprised off-the-job training. This is an essential criteria for funding, and your delivery must be quantified and qualified and linked directly to the apprenticeship. If this evidence is not available and we cannot confirm 20% of the job, then all funding can be at risk. And I cannot emphasize this enough. You know, it is so important that you have this evidence in place. For the apprenticeship agreement and the commitment statement, providers must ensure there is a signed apprenticeship agreement in place, which is an agreement between the employer and the apprentice, and a commitment statement, which is between the apprentice, the provider, or the employer provider and the employer at the start of an apprenticeship. These should be two separate documents. We quite often find that these don't exist, or they don't include what they should include, they're not being signed, etc. Again, this could result in funding being called back, but we do obviously try and see what if there's any alternative evidence in respect to this, but it's not always the case. For the negotiated price, the provider must retain evidence to confirm how the total negotiated price is calculated for each learner, and it must be clear that only eligible costs have been included. In some cases, we have found that the negotiated price recorded on the ILR includes elements that are not eligible for funding. So please refer to the funding rules for what constitutes an eligible cost. But if we cannot evidence this or we cannot see this, then again, this could have an impact. Next slide, please. Minimum duration. So apprenticeships that do not meet the minimum duration are one of the most common errors. This is an essential criteria for funding, and if this condition is not met, the whole apprenticeship for that learner will be ineligible for funding. So we could potentially claw back all funds paid in respect of that learner. And the start date error could affect this as well. So if your start date was not right, and it happened, your start of learning actually happened much later, then it could mean that your minimum duration is not met. So both together are very important. The learner status. So funding errors have occurred when funding is claimed for learners' continued participation on the apprenticeship programme, but this cannot be confirmed from the evidence, or there is a lack of evidence of learning activity, usually for periods of learning or from the learner start date. So it's really important that that evidence is there. And again, that could result in a funding error. Payment of employer contributions. So like this could be the way non-levy employers or levy employers who have no levy remaining are required to pay a contribution towards the cost of the agreed apprenticeship, or it could be or the total of any negotiated price over the funding band maximum. In a number of instances, it was noted that there was no evidence that employers had been invoiced for the co-investment or the value of the negotiated price over the funding band maximum. So please ensure you have this evidence. End dates. So funding errors frequently occur where learners have left early, gone on a break in learning, withdrawn without an achievement, etc., where the actual end dates are either not recorded or have been recorded incorrectly on the ILR and not supported by underlying records. It must be the last day of participated learning. This results in funding being claimed beyond the time when the learner has last participated in learning activity for any of the funded learning names, and we will therefore need to claw this back. So this again is a very common issue. If the end date is not correct, then we'll claw back the funding. What has been paid past that, what should have been the actual end date. For recognition of prior attainment, for all apprenticeships, providers need to ensure that prior attainment is evidenced and held on file. Learners must be enrolled on the appropriate English and Maths learning names as set out in the funding guidance. Where learners are deemed to be exempt, this must be evidenced in line with the funding rule requirements and retained in the evidence pack. Again, this is something that we often don't find. Next slide, please. So we've seen an increase in providers claiming learn support for learners who do not meet the criteria. So the funding rules clearly specify that learning support is available to meet the costs of putting in place a reasonable adjustment as set out in the Equality Act 2010. For all learners with learning difficulty or disability where this affects their ability to continue and achieve their learning goal. In addition, we provide learning support for apprentices with learning difficulties or disabilities as defined in the Education Act 1996. So this includes individuals who self-declare a learning difficulty or disability and those who do not have a diagnosis of learning difficulty or disability, but in relation to whom the provider has identified to us a learning need. Often the evidence does not support this, and learning support has either been claimed for, for learners who do not have a disability or learning difficulty, or the reasons for the support were poorly documented. It's really, really important that this is, this is evidenced correctly, and we've been finding more and more errors on this just recently, so I cannot emphasize this one enough. Subcontracting. there's been a number of common issues that have been identified where subcontracting arrangements were not fully compliant with the funding rules. And for this, I mean like subcontracts were not always in place or were signed after the delivery had started, or the funding delivered on the subcontracts exceeds the limits set out in the contracts, or the contracts did not contain all the minimum clauses required by the funding rules. In addition, the most common finding for apprenticeships were that the details listed on the subcontractor declaration did not reconcile to the details recorded on the ILR, or the provision was not declared where required, either on the subcontractor declaration or on the ILR, or both. So we've had lots of issues on that. We've also identified some providers where the volume of training and or on-programme assessment that they directly deliver for each employer did not have some substance as required. Delivery must not be a token amount to satisfy this rule, and it must not be limited to a brief input at the start of each employer's programme or involve delivery to just a few of a large number of apprentices. The rules for 21-22, though, I know have been updated slightly to give some example of what is not allowable here. But I think there's more work on this. So these are all the common issues, but I think the main messages coming out of this webinar for me is please ensure you have the evidence as per the evidence pack and the funding rules, and please keep checking your data. So please do use PDSATs or look at the funding rules monitoring reports. And thank you, that's it from me. So I'll hand back to Nick. Next slide, please.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Helen. That was really useful. That was an excellent run through, particularly the common issues. That prompted quite a few questions as we were going through. So we'll have a look at those. Listen, thanks everybody for submitting your questions. We didn't have an awful lot coming through, but then all of a sudden they just exploded. So we've got quite a few questions to try and get through. I think, Helen, there's quite a few for you in the first instance, so we'll get cracking with those, and then I'll call. I think Daniel's got a few to come afterwards. First of all, there's lots of interest in when universities are going to be audited. When can universities expect to be included in the audit list, and does the fact that they deliver degree apprenticeships have an impact on when they'll be audited as well, please?
Yeah, so we at the currently how it stands is that we get assurance on universities funding on apprenticeships from the OFS. So the OFS give us assurance on an annual basis on this. So we've been relying on that to an extent, but as universities are growing their apprenticeship provision, and also that we're recognising there has been some compliance issues with some universities, we've made that decision now that we're going to start to include universities. But I think our initial thoughts have been that we will do a pilot of some universities initially, and then perhaps roll it out into our normal business as usual program going forward. And this is something that we have started to talk about, and it's something that will definitely be within the next 6 months, hopefully, that we can make a start on looking at some universities.
Okay,
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a question about independent training providers and when they get control visits. What's the sample size for these visits, the control visits?
Sharon, are you on the call here? You might be better off answering this one. Sharon, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me okay? Hopefully you can. So the control visits that we complete, as Helen mentioned earlier, are for providers where they are new to our delivery. So we haven't had a contract with the provider previously. There don't tend to be huge numbers, but we will look to include in our population all providers where they've not been in the full provider population for a funding audit because they've been new in year to the SFA. So for those providers, we'll select a sample, dependent on the numbers of providers that are in that category would depend on the sample size. So we would complete a sample of audits at those providers where we'd look at the controls, as Helen mentioned earlier, so looking at the compliance and checking the understanding of the funding rules and checking that they are clear on the requirements that are needed, etc. So we don't correct and report funding errors at those visits. That's mostly around the control environment, but we would request that data's adjusted where we do find any issues with the data that would impact on funding. We would ask for those corrections to be made at that point. So not too many. It does depend, as I say, on the population that we've got, on how many we'd actually look at. I think there was also a question around the controls questionnaire and if that is available. The controls questionnaire is part of our work programme, and I'm not sure on the time frame actually for the publication of the work programme, so probably would put that to one side and maybe we can come back on that side of things. But yes, we have in the past published the control questionnaire, which people have found really helpful because it's a really useful tool to check to make sure that you've got sufficient systems and control in place when you're administering the apprenticeship programme.
Thanks, Sharon. You're stealing my MC role by asking and answering your own questions. So thanks for that.
Sorry.
That's all right, no worries. So there's a question about FIS, and is FIS a PDSAT tool? That was for Daniel.
Okay, yeah. So the FIS is an independent tool, but it is linked to the PDSATs. So if you run the ILR through the FIS, you'll create the indicative funding for the ILR file that you send in.
So just for the recording as well, to make sure we've got this, can you just explain what the FIS is?
The FIS is the funding information system. So it'll calculate the funding per learner as a provider as a whole. So you'll feed your ILR data into there and it'll calculate the indicative funding for the year. It can be linked to the PDSATs. So if you don't run an ILR file through the FIS, you can run the ILR file through the PDSATs, but it won't give you the funding calculation columns at the end. If you run your ILR file through the funding information system and then run the funding information system for the PDSATs, you'll have the PDSATs with the funding calculations. But the FIS, the funding information system, creates its own data outputs.
Brilliant. So the next question is, if you find an error relating to the previous academic year and make the correction, will the SFA invoice or just adjust on R14?
So if the audit is for 2021, say, it depends on what the error is. So for example, if the error is a start date error that's in a prior year impact, or it's the total negotiated price that started in a prior year, you can invariably correct them in year, and it's likely that there's going to be no invoice and or offset, but that does depend case by case on the learner status in the following year. So some errors will have to be dealt with via offset or invoice, and again, that'll be dependent on what the learner status is and what the kind of error is. So it varies basically, but a provider will be told and agreement will be reached before any decisions made. So at audit, we will agree offset and invoice and data amendments.
Yeah, okay, I've got another one for you as well, Daniel. Will the audit be based on 2021 R14 data or include the current in-year data from 21-22?
So currently we're looking at 2021 data only. So by definition, it will be R14 if I prep an audit from today. But nonetheless, we won't be looking at the 2021-22 unless we're looking at data amendments and recovery. So that's where we will go into the following year just to make sure that the changes have been made. But ultimately, if we are auditing 2021, the audit opinion and conclusion will be based on 2021 data.
Okay. Helen, one for you. Is the final report from the assurance visit made public?
No, it's not. So the final report will just go to the provider, but it will also be shared with the territorial team at the apprenticeship teams or ESF teams as well, even for their information, because they will then be responsible for following up on any findings and recommendations that we make, and also just for their awareness more than anything. But no, it doesn't go in the public domain.
Okay, and a question from a new provider that just literally had apprentices start in September, and they're asking the question, when do you think they're likely to get their first assurance visit?
So if they are selected as part of the random sample, then for 21-22 funding, this will be next year. So it'll probably be from next April, May time if we start our audits as we used to before COVID. They won't get audited till next year now.
Okay.
But with regards to the controls visit, sorry, with regards to the controls visit, they may be in the population for the controls visit. So it might not be a full funding audit until next year, but they may be in the population for a controls visit from potentially January onwards.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Sharon. So there's a question about frequency of audits. So how frequently can a provider expect to be seen?
It can. So with the random, and it is purely random, what does happen sometimes, out of all the thousands of providers we've got, a provider is selected again. So they may be selected one year and then they're selected the following year, and they're just very unlucky. And sometimes that can happen for a third year, but we don't necessarily, we might say, or we run the random sample so that we don't have auditors being audited every year. But some providers have not been audited for several years now, so it's just purely based on the random selection. But as I said to you earlier, we do select a sample of risk audits. So if you've had a bad audit, so your opinion was unsatisfactory and you had lots of errors, then you could be selected again the following year for another audit, so we can see that you've actually made the changes we asked you to make and you're no longer making the same errors. But audits, as I say, it's different for every provider. I think there was a question before that, Nick. I'm quite happy to answer on the 5% error rate.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, absolutely. Go. I'll answer that question. There was a question, but just basically asking for an explanation of what the 5% error rate was. Is what 5% of what?
Sorry. Yeah. So I probably didn't explain. So within the sample, so you've got your 30 learners, and then there'll be a value assigned to that. So it's basically what funding you've claimed on the ILR for those 30 learners. If we find that 5% of that value is in error, then that's what constitutes the opinion that we give. So so if there was like 10 of those 30 learners were in error, for example, then you get an unsatisfactory opinion. It's 5% of that sample value, basically.
Okay, another one for you then, Helen. Do training providers need to source and complete their own external audits?
So the external audits, obviously, some providers have to have an external audit. So like the colleges, obviously they have their external audit on their financial statements. Some ITPs may have their financial statements come and do an audit, but there was not necessarily a requirement for them to do this additional piece of work. But I mean, I would say that as good practice is good for, if they've got any external audit happening, that they do look at some of the funding that's been paid, and that those funds have been used for the purposes intended. But there's no mandatory requirement for ITPs at the moment. And I say that at the moment because there is a new ITP framework which is being looked at.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Daniel, I've got a run of questions for you if I can, and I'm conscious of the time, so if we could try and keep these, the answers brief, we'll get through as many as we can. So is there still a 5-day rule for the start of the start date evidence, i.e. evidence within the first 5 days of an apprentice starting?
I wouldn't call it a rule, it's more of a concession. It's a 7-day rule, I believe, that's made, but it's not relevant to qualifying periods and minimum durations. So it's more like a bit of a concession that we wouldn't raise management letter points if it's that close, as long as there's no funding impacts.
Okay, brilliant. And then I'm going to read this out, and I don't understand the acronym. So would the AA and CS be a funding error or a quality error if combined? So if you can explain the answer to that and explain what they are, that would be brilliant.
Yeah, so the apprenticeship agreement and commitment statement, they can't be combined. It's a management letter point. It's not a funding error, but the contents of the apprenticeship agreement, the contents of that combined document must fulfill the requirements. So if it's an invalid apprenticeship agreement because there's missing information, then yes, it's funds at risk. We'd ask you to get a new one and split them up effectively. But it's to do with the contents rather than the fact that they are combined.
Okay, brilliant. Off the job, obviously that was a big thing that Helen mentioned in her presentation. So we've been asked if there's any best practice or evidence, examples of evidence of off the job training that's available for providers to see.
We don't dictate necessarily what we should specifically be seeing. It depends on whether the provider's paper, internet-based. It could come in very many ways, shapes, or forms. There is a link in the funding rules to an additional, quite lengthy document to do with off the job that provides a few hints and tips. But if I was personally going to say something, I'd say keep it smart, keep it specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. For example, don't just have a random total at the end. Show us that aggregation through, say, reviews or a table or declarations by the learner through their apprenticeship. But like I say, it's just got to be obvious. Yeah, but we don't give direct advice in that respect.
Okay, and then again, whilst I've still got you a few more around the apprenticeship agreement and the commitment statement, can it be one electronic document as long as there's a separate page for each and a signature on both parts? And also, must both of those documents be signed by all parties before the apprentice starts?
The first part, yes. The second part, it's the apprenticeship agreement is only signed by the employer and the learner, and the commitment statements are tripartite. But yeah, it can be a continuous document, but bear in mind that if you've got a problem with the apprenticeship agreement and we ask for a new apprenticeship agreement, you'll be redoing the whole document if you've got a problem with the commitment statement. Same applies. So yes, as long as they are two distinct documents, and I've seen many electronic ones that are just a scroll down and everything's in there, but the documents are obviously distinct. That's fine, absolutely.
And whereabouts when the commitment statement and the individual learning plan as well?
Yeah, and the other bit was that yes, they do have to be completed at least on the start date, if not before. They can have an ILP supporting the commitment statement, but it's got to be obvious they are one of the same document. Because we appreciate that we want the commitment statement to be quite short, and usually an ILP has a lot more information. But yeah, reference them together.
Okay, cool. How does the provider fund ineligible but required costs such as enrolment, initial assessments, etc.?
Is this the profit margin question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So ineligible costs obviously aren't ineligible. If you so wish to funds, per se, probably not the right word, but through your profit margins, then that's completely up to you. There's no requirement to tell us what your profit margin is. Nonetheless, when you negotiate a price and you provide the evidence, there shouldn't be any ineligible costs in there. I mean, you can tell us what your profit margin is. It's more pertinent for when you're delivering to your own employees, though.
Yeah. Okay. Another question for you then, Daniel, as well. Can you clarify what evidence of learning should look like? So as soon as a learner starts on apprenticeship, they're in learning on the job. So how does this not start? So how is this not the start date? So question between, I think, start date and apprenticeship start date.
Yeah, I think this has got quite a few questions about it. So I can't tell you what it should look like, but the activity should demonstrate, or it should be documented, and it should demonstrate that the learners actually started some learning directly related to the requirements of the apprenticeship. So it could be imparting skills, knowledge, and behaviours. Could be functional skills.
Yeah. So link it back
but it has to demonstrate. Sorry,
go on, carry on.
No, it has to be documented to demonstrate that.
Okay, cool. Going back to the agreement and the commitment statement again, can they get away with one document with one signature, or do they need both? So they're saying is one signature sufficient, or do both documents need to be clearly headed?
They'd have to be separate documents. It's a management letter point. Again, the same applies to the previous answer that we had there. It's always supposed to have been two separate documents. The guidance just wasn't that clear, I don't think, in the early days. So obviously, therefore, it's a management letter point.
Okay. And I've scrolled through and lost other questions. So let me just pick on this one while I find my place. What happens if the employer has been invoiced and doesn't pay their contribution in terms of co-investment?
You can't complete the PMR records, so that will be a contractual issue between the provider and the employer. Hence, it'll be a good idea to have them in your written agreements before the apprenticeship starts.
Okay.
I would also urge them probably to contact the territorial manager.
Right. Excellent. There's a question about planned end dates. So can you clarify the planned end date should take into account the endpoint assessment timings?
From August 2019 starts, the planned end date will be the practical period end date. So the end of the provider's delivery for the starts prior years. It will encompass the endpoint assessment period. The achievement date, when you put the achievement date in, that's what tells us the difference between the practical period end date and the end of the apprenticeship, i.e. the 372 days. So no, from August 2019, it should not include the gateway period, the EPA period.
So then in terms of the achievement date, is it when the apprentice has completed their endpoint assessment, or when they've got the certificate?
When they take their assessment, the date of their assessment.
Okay. Question, Helen, for you about the audit process and how long the process takes, just as a general rule.
So how long is a piece of string? You know, it's so, you know, the field work part, if you're out on site, I would say probably on average is about a week, but it's all the bits after that take the time. So if we do find errors and then there's a requirement for the provider then do 100% check, then obviously we've got to wait for them to do that. So that could be another 2 weeks after that. And then we have to review that. And then sometimes if additional evidence is still coming in after the fieldwork stage, we're still reviewing that. So it can be a bit of a game ping pong almost. So you're going backwards and forwards to the provider, asking more questions, asking for more evidence, looking at that, and then saying whether or not it's right or it's wrong. We're continually updating the feedback. So the feedback is like a big Excel spreadsheet with all the learner names and where we detail the findings, you know, the issues potentially, and the provider responds on that, and then that's continually being reviewed, and areas are closed down where we do get more evidence, but it can just take a while. I mean, obviously we don't want audits to drag on months, but sometimes they do simply because they've been very problematic, but in the main they shouldn't be that long. And we always endeavour to get them closed down as soon as possible, but they're all different, and just depends as well on how many funding streams we've got to look at, etc. So
yeah. Okay. I'm really conscious of time. I just want to ask two more, and then we'll move on to the next part. So a question about learner support. So how can you draw down learner support funding for the assessment element of determining whether or not an apprentice needs support, or can they only draw down funding for the actual support?
Is that for me?
That's for you, Daniel.
I can
yes,
answer.
right.
I can answer that one actually, Dan, if you want. Yeah.
Yep.
So the learning support is paid. So this is the £150 a month. So we start paying that as soon as the learning support has been identified. So it's actually for the actual support that you are providing. So as I say, we will pay you that £150 a month, and we expect you to demonstrate that you are giving that support from the time that you claim it to the time that you don't claim it, and we expect you to review that on a regular basis, that learner still needs that support.
Okay.
It's based on delivery. Then it's based on delivery, but the premise is that you have the assessment to support the delivery.
You must. Yeah, you must have the assessment. But if you're thinking that we pay for that, if it's some complex assessment of some kind, no. It's just that you get that £150, which is a flat rate, which covers everything. Basically, you may not even spend £150, but we still pay it.
Okay. Excellent. And then my last question is about the last day of learning. So does last day of learning link only to what could be evidence on the off-the-job training, or would this be engagement in learning, sort of visiting, learning the environment, progress reviews, etc.?
It's a learning activity, so not necessarily off the job. So is the learning, is the learner still in learning? It's the same as the start date, really. It most certainly can't be on the job. Because that's just a good employer. But it's a planned learning activity that you're expecting them to do. Endpoint assessment is in effect a learning activity, or regarded as one, but it's neither off the job or within the planned duration. So
excellent. Right, so apologies to everybody for running slightly late. I did mention that at the beginning, that I may steal a couple of extra minutes just to go through some questions. We've still got a bunch more questions that we could have gone through and asked, but what we'll do is we'll gather up all of those unanswered questions about the audit process, and we'll respond to everybody with a message that's on the call today by email. So look out for that in the coming week or so. But thank you, Helen, Sharon, and Daniel, for going through as many questions as you did. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Brilliant. So I'll skip through these quite quickly. I always talk to you about the support videos that are available on YouTube. So we've got 3 channels. One is using the Apprenticeship Service, and you'll see different videos on there. So you'll see things like how to register an account, how to reserve funding, and also on there you'll see a playlist specifically for webinar recordings. That's where we'll put a recording of today's session. And that will be up on YouTube in about a week or so. And then there's another playlist which is about videos created just to support apprenticeships in general on there as well. What I would like to point out is that in the Apprenticeship Service video playlist, there's new videos about the transfer service. So one for employers who can pledge some of their unspent levy funding, and another video about how to view those pledges and apply to receive that transfers pledge as well. So please do go and have a look at those. And if you're on there, make sure you subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon. And if you do that, you get alerts when new content's uploaded. Next slide, please. I will always continue to plug the Twitter channel at ESFA Digital. We put lots of stuff out there about what's happening within the service, so any developments and any updates, and any information about future webinars. So do subscribe to at ESFA Digital, and yeah, so follow us on there. And then on to the next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of further support, we've got links to a document on the common findings from assurance visits on gov.uk. There's the provider data self-assessment toolkit link, and there's also links to the funding rules monitoring reports, as well as the funding rules themselves. So please look at those, and they're on the handout that you should have downloaded from the handout section. And then other ways to stay up to date. I will always keep going on about apprenticeships.gov.uk. You really need to have a look at that if you haven't already. It's a great resource to point your employers to for explanations about the apprenticeship service and apprenticeships in general. So please do look at that resource. We've also got our ESFA Digital blog that we publish fairly regularly. And if you look at any future webinars, if you want to look at what future webinars we've got, follow the link on screen as well. Articles in ESFA updates, we get a lot of traffic on there looking at the stuff. So if you don't see ESFA update, have a look at that. They're really good for keeping up to date. And then finally, if you've got specific queries about the apprenticeship service or about sort of the more technical stuff around guidance that we couldn't cover today, you can contact, you can look at the self-service support tool, or you can contact the helpline on 08000 150 600 and speak to one of the advisors, or you can email them as well, and all the details are on the slide for that. So that's the end of the session. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to the presenters for being brilliant and going through what they did and going through as many questions as they did. And please remember, as you leave the webinar, please go to that short survey and complete a few details in there. So bye everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. See ya.
Thank you.